So, bass trombones. What makes them different than tenor trombones, and what makes bass trombones different from each other, and how can we try out different mouthpieces, because that's something I have to do in every video apparently, and I have fun doing. Today we're just going to go over what makes a bass trombone, how does it sound different than tenor trombone, the lowly tenor trombone back there, and how do they sound different from each other depending on different configurations. We are going to go over 4 bass trombones. This is my personal bass trombone. This is a Larry Minick customized Conn 62H from the Elkhart factory. It's got this fun thing called tuning and slide, and Larry Minick converted it from dependent rotors, which you can see over here. One rotor is dependent on the other working, to independent rotors. We also have an Edwards with dual Thayer valves. Thayer valves are known for being very open, very resonant valves for a lot of people. And that's like a go-to option for symphonic trombonists. Then we also have this Edwards with dependent, again, where the second valve only works if you engage the first valve. You can see it's not on the neck, but it's actually on the tubing of the first valve. This is a dependent Edwards with Rotax valves. And finally, we have kind of more of a budget model. We have a Jupiter 740 with independent rotor valves. That's kind of like what you would see from beginning bass trombone or high school trombonists, what they might be using before they get a more professionally adapted instrument. These 3 instruments belong to the University of Oklahoma and will be used for the studio. And this is my own personal horn that I've been using for years, including in various gigs around New York City and Broadway and different orchestras all over. And then we have 4 mouthpieces to try, again, because that's fun for me. We have this Momo 60 star, which means it has some sort of heat or cold treatment on it. I'm not quite clear which. It's from a small boutique manufacturer in Japan called Momo, and I've liked it a lot. I got it thinking it was a tenor mouthpiece, turned out to be a bass, turned out to work well on some basses. We have a Griego GP6. This is kind of one of the industry standard orchestral bass trombone mouthpieces for a long time. GP stands for Jerry Pagano, who was the bass trombonist of the St. Louis Symphony for a number of years, recently retired. We also have a Shires Vintage 1 1/4 G. This is like a mouthpiece made by Pickett that came with a lot of Shires instruments, especially ones that were more inspired by older models. And it turns out to be the one that I usually use with my older trombone. It's just like the vintage connection kind of works. And finally, for fun, we have the main mouthpiece of the bass trombone world. We have a Bach 1.5 G. Tried, true, tested. It also has this little nub on it. Somebody screwed in something. I'm guessing they had big hands and it was to keep their finger on it. No idea why it's there, otherwise that's my best guess. All right. What makes a bass trombone different than a tenor trombone? Well, normally when we have a bass instrument, we think that the instrument has to be larger than normal. Like a bass clarinet is like way big compared to a regular clarinet. A contrabass bassoon is much bigger than a bassoon, and so on and so forth. Usually when we think bass, like a string bass is up here and a cello's over here. Yeah. However, with bass trombone, it's about the same amount of tubing, and it's about the same size. If we put them next to each other, you'll notice this one actually looks a little bit taller if I put the bells next to each other. Yeah? But the differences are the bore is slightly larger. On a standard orchestral trombone, the conventional setup is a .547 bore. On a bass trombone, it's a .562. Makes a little bit of a difference. And if you'll notice, the bells tend to be slightly larger. A tenor trombone bell can be anywhere from 7.5 to 8.5 inches, depending on the style that the people like. Usually large bore trombones in that 8 to 8.5 inch range. And bass trombone bells can go from 9 inches all the way up to 10.5 or even 11 inches for some custom orders. I used to play on an 11-inch Bach 50 bass trombone, and it was just the craziest, hardest to control sound. So you hear some slight differences in the timbre. that's the sound of a tenor trombone playing in the low range. Notes in those ranges would often be given to the bass trombone historically, and the bass trombone has a little bit more facility with the adaptation of the second valve in those ranges. And with the width of the bore and the slightly larger belt, it has a slightly different sound in that register as well. You might notice even like what sounds like a bit more sound in general. That works well because the bass is a great bridge between the tenor trombones and the tuba in the orchestral setting. Now, the other main separation factor with the bass is the second valve. You'll notice that my tenor trombone has one valve, just as the one. What this does is it puts it in the key of F. Well, bass trombones have two valves. There are some different tuning systems out there, but I am using the predominant tuning system, in which the first valve is tuned to F, the second valve is tuned to G flat, and both valves down tuned to D. Like the tenor, that's the first valve. Now with the second valve, you'll hear G flat instead of an F on the first valve. And with both valves down, the fundamental note will be D. So it tends to give you a lot more options in that low range. And it has this note. Low B2, or the B that's, C4 being middle C on the piano, C2 octaves, a C an octave beneath that, and then the B. Yep. The tenor trombone doesn't normally have low B unless you make some massive adaptations to the tuning and you lip down a lot. So, when you add valving, and this is a big part of why bass is bass and tenor is tenor, when you add valving to the back of the horn, you don't add valving to the front of the horn. So the tuning becomes a little different and you actually lose a slide position. Without the valve, you have 7 positions on the slide. With the valve, you kind of have an out of tune 6 positions. And I can't get that low B unless the slide was able to extend like out here, which, doesn't work. It comes apart. What you can do on tenors, you could lip down the note, and you can kind of fake that a little bit. But with both valves on the bass trombone, it becomes fully chromatic down there. And what's also fun is you have the same note as pedal B flat on the trombone. You actually have that as an extra octave down with both valves. But the key note here is the low B. That's why bass trombone has 2 valves, and because it's a low note, that's why it has the larger valving, the larger bore size and the slightly larger bell to help support a rich sound in that register. So, bass versus tenor. You're not going to get so much extra sound from a bass that it's going to drown out tenors or other instruments. In fact, I think trombones, while they're capable of having a ton of power, they are not always the loudest instrument in the orchestra, and other instruments really giving it their all can really balance them. This is true of the bass trombone, this is true of the tenor trombone. What you're getting is a slightly different timbre and a little bit more facility in the low register, including the note B2 when you write for bass trombone. Like, I wouldn't try to put 2 tenor trombones on one part and 1 bass trombone on another part and just call it a day and say that they'll balance. In fact, a section of like 2 bass trombones, 2 second trombones, and 1 principal, if you had 5, I think would actually balance a lot better because the ears hear high pitches better than they hear low pitches. All right. So when you write for bass trombone, it has this richer, more open timbre to it. Not necessarily louder, but just wider, very warm, very, sometimes even mellow, pretty sound that is a little bit more inherent to the opening of the bore and the width of the bell. And different mouthpieces will do different things to that also, but I'd like to show you the difference really quickly between all four of these bass trombones, because bass trombones can really differ from one to another. So, we are just going to take the same mouthpiece. This is the mouthpiece I like for this vintage trombone, the Shires 1.5G Vintage. And we're just going to play a couple measures of kind of like the standard bass trombone solo that most people play, the Lebedev, which is a piece I happen to like a lot. I know that, you know, as with any standard, it can get a little bit tiring to always hear it and always see it over and over again, but it kind of provides a good litmus test for what we're listening to. Here is the Minick adapted Conn 62H. Fun solo. As I switch between all these different valve systems and I remind myself of the quirks of each tuning system and each way the slide goes, you might hear me drop a note here or there, but this is just to get an overview of the sound. One fun thing about this trombone is there's no tuning slide back here on the main tuning brace. The tuning slide is actually, the tuning mechanism is on the slide itself. This is called tuning in slide, where you kind of adjust it through this mechanism. You pull and you tighten, and you can go sharper or flatter here rather than here. But what that means is that the tuning isn't as standardized, and it's a little bit of a quirky horn, which is really fun. Next up, we have the Edwards dual Thayer trombone. This is kind of what would be considered like a very, very good high standard orchestral bass trombone. The Thayer valves, they're a little bit bigger and they just tend to move air really well compared to most rotors in terms of like the ability to have like a free feeling blow, which a lot of people really like. However, they don't get more sound than rotors. There's just a different feel on the face and the air, which can very often lead us to believe we're getting more sound, but it isn't always true. This trombone, though, it's made to be kind of an orchestral tank. It works very well in that purpose. Let's hear some of the same Lebedev on that. Instrument in terms of always getting a really big, fat orchestral sound out all the time. Next, we have kind of a nice, interesting contrast. This is also an Edwards. They have very similar bells. It's the same manufacturer, but this one has a radically different valve setup. Whereas this one has double Thayer valves, this one has what's called dependent Rotax Rotors. And the dependent part isn't like the Rotax part is like the trademark name. Dependent is the setup name. So while the rest of these have inline rotors, which means you could use them independently, you can use the second valve or the first valve. With this, the second rotor is set up within the first rotor, so you can't actually engage this. It won't do anything, except give you kind of a crazy vibrato for trying to like move the horn around, unless the first trigger is engaged. Some people like these dependent setups because there's less mass to move through on the neck. You're not putting air through two sets of valves. But it's a personal preference. It really doesn't do a crazy amount to change the sound. It does limit some options. There are some really nice options for using the second valve alone. A lot of the C's in staff, bass clef C3 that I played on the other horns, I use just the second valve for in kind of third position rather than the first valve and second, because it's kind of nice to move first, second, third from B flat, C to D, but that won't be an option for me on this horn. Let's hear the Lebedev sounds like this, and I'll try not to mix up my valves. Always a good idea to double check your tuning when you go from one to the other. It can be kind of crazy where everybody keeps their different tuning slides because basses can be very highly individualized. And finally, we have more of a budget option for high school programs that need to like afford a bass trombone and don't want to spend $5,000 to $8,000 range, and they want to get a bass trombone in that $2,000 to $3,000 range. And for students who are heading off to college or getting their first bass trombone and can't break the bank yet, this Jupiter is a really good horn, intermediate horn. Let's see what it sounds like. This uses independent Thayers. I hope the tuning's okay in it. Let's find out as we play it. Independent Thayers, no, independent Rotors, sorry. Yeah, let's make sure we get that one right. Also, this one has a lot more weight towards the back, which also probably feels a little bit better for student trombonists. Like, it just wants to really sit on the shoulder, whereas with these other ones, you might see I have like a hand grip in here, because it leans a little further forward. All right, let's try it out as a sound test. Yeah, so it still gets a nice sound. It's a little bit harder to control, and the ergonomics of the horn, like I find that I'm actually pushing this second valve against my finger a whole bunch, which wouldn't feel nice. And the valves themselves feel a touch more sluggish and unresponsive. And the horn also breaks up in kind of some like, not pleasant ways. But that gives us a good idea of what we're working with these 4 different bass trombones and how they might sound different from each other. They're all different configurations. They're all really nice to figure out. The second part of this is that mouthpiece choice, I find, can matter even more on bass than it does on tenor. So let me see if I could bring up some bass excerpts, maybe. I should have a couple here. If not, bass trombone excerpts. Nice. We'll compare a little bit of the Bach Sarabande and maybe just a couple measures of the Haydn. Don't expect me to sound super great on this. There are a ton of great bass trombonists you can go and listen to who really spend all their time on bass trombone. But it'll be nice to get kind of some sound samples of what these different mouthpieces are like on this material. Okay, let's start off comparing the four mouthpieces on this vintage Conn. I'm just going to play, I don't know, 8 measures of the Bach Sarabande, hopefully not too badly. And then maybe something like a couple measures of Haydn Creation. Yeah, let's just go with that. So that's the Shires Vintage 1 1/4 G. I think that they put the vintage in mind because they wanted it to work with kind of like older models of trombone. Let's go up next. We'll just go in order of what I have here. This is the infamous Bach 1 1/2 G. It is the bass trombone starter mouthpiece. This is where people go. And you can find pages and pages and pages of chat about it on the trombone chat forum of whether or not anybody should ever use a Bach 1 1/2 G. But I think it's innocuous. It's a mouthpiece. It's more what somebody does with it than what it is. Let's hear what the infamous Bach 1 1/2 G sounds like on this same excerpt. So it felt a little harder to jump down to the low notes, but it's still a nice mouthpiece. Next up we have Momo 60 star, either a heat or a cold treatment, some type of temperature treatment that they did to it. It is hard to access the website and find information from boutique Japanese mouthpiece manufacturers. If I knew more, I'd love to tell you. But this is a mouthpiece that just feels nice. It ends up, well, we'll see what it's like on the other instruments, but let's see what it's like on the Bach Sarabande with this. Sound. I really like the smoothness of this mouthpiece, both in the feel on the face and the feel when I'm playing for the music. Finally, let's check out the Griego GP6. This is another very standardized bass trombone mouthpiece. This is what you might see from most undergrad and graduate collegiate players. They might be playing on a Griego Marquis or a Brian Heck mouthpiece or a GP or a GP6 mouthpiece. You'll see those more often than not at kind of the collegiate and grad level. The biggest jump up in size. as my control over it, honestly, very slightly. It's just the biggest like cold water bath of a difference of a mouthpiece that I can make from it. All right, let's try the same 4 mouthpieces out really quickly on the Haydn creation. This is one of like the really standardized excerpts in the bass trombone thing. It's like kind of the bass equivalent of the tenor Mozart to Bamira. You know, they're just on every audition, and this is kind of one of the big standards. So let's hope I don't mess it up too much, and let's have some fun and just try it out. That's enough. So we did beginning to A on it. Let's quickly try it out on our ever so favorite Bach 1.5 G. Challenge to kind of corral and hold into place the way I like it to. But yeah, not the worst mouthpiece in the world. Let's try our Momo 60 out on this. Fun to play. And finally, in the interest of time, let's just go straight to the GP6 and see how that goes. So that's the 4 mouthpieces on those 2 excerpts. I don't want to keep everybody here for forever, so we're just going to jump straight to the next, and we're going to skip the Bach 1.5 G, and I'm going to try out the Shires Vintage 1.25 G, and then we will go straight to the Momo and then straight to the GP6. So we're going to try out those 3 mouthpieces on the Bach Sarabande first. Is that the vintage mouthpiece sounds a lot different than the more modernized mouthpieces on this dual Thayer Edwards. Let's hear how the Momo 60 sounds on this same Bach. let's try out the GP6 on this. So this is kind of our most standard orchestral setup that you'll see today. If this has any sort of like stereotype to it, it's more of a commercial crossover horn. You used to see a lot of like Conn's in British orchestras, the LA recording scene, and the New York Broadway scene. It usually is known for having like a bit more bite and versatility and being really good on close miking, whereas this style of setup has become kind of American standardized orchestral setup. Let's hear the most standard orchestral setup of all these horns here on the same, Bach. And now, let's jump to the Haydn creation. We are going to go back to our Shires Vintage 1¼ G, and we're going to try it on our more orchestral bass setup. Oh, my first valve mess up. I tried to use second valve for a low C in third position. No, I tried to use second valve. Anyway, I tried to use the wrong valve for the wrong note, whichever it was. So now that we got that out of the way, let's try the same thing on this Momo 60 mouthpiece. That is such a fun excerpt to play. I guess it helps that like being primarily a tenor, I don't have to play it like 14,000 times. So, we just have to do it like X amount of times in a row. It's not as bad as having to constantly work on it for years and years and years. Yeah. All right. Now we're trying the GP6, our most orchestral bass setup on this item. That's really fun to play. The low notes really pop out with this setup, although my control isn't as much there as I feel like it is on the other mouthpieces. I would chalk that up to kind of user error and trying to switch between so many different instruments in so many different ways, more than the instrument itself. Let's try out our dependent Rotax valve, Edward. We'll do our vintage 1¼ G on some Bach, and then we'll go through the Momo and the GP6. Here it is, just a little bit more to really tune where we want to on that. It does not like to move much, but that happens when you have 3 valves. Let's try out our Momo 60 on the Bach. Make sure this is where we want, maybe a little bit less on this F valve too. Watch it go super flat now. Let's find out. Should theoretically have a little bit less resistance, or the horn itself, but that's not quite what I'm feeling. It could just be the horn and it could be me. Let's try the same thing on the Griego, the GP6, and let's see if the larger, more modern style bass trombone, most modern style bass trombone mouthpiece kind of helps this out a little bit. Of fairness, let's try out these 3 mouthpieces on some Haydn. I would say though that of all these, this is my least comfortable right off the bat. Doesn't mean worse, it just means I'm having the hardest time kind of negotiating what it wants out of me, which is a big thing with bass trombones, especially in the high-end bass trombone world. You have to find your way to work with the instrument less than like blow down massive amounts of air and always just like force it to do what you want. You really have to find the proper resonance for where it wants to be. I'm having the hardest time finding it on this horn, but let's see if the Haydn goes a little better. Second valve right now. I keep wanting to those C's fall so naturally with the independent second valve, and I got to continually remind myself it's not there. Let's try the same thing with the Momo 60. Independent Japanese boutique maker, it really feels like it's suiting this horn a lot better. And then there was just some user error on some of the higher notes, so I kind of want to try just one or two of those bars again, because I like the way this mouthpiece feels with this horn. Yeah, that feels pretty good. Let's try out the GP6 on the Haydn and see one more time what this feels like on this horn. So we have kind of our biggest mouthpiece, our most industry standard orchestral mouthpiece on this horn. I tried to do C in trigger 2, I really wanted to, but doesn't work. Don't do that. My mind's wandering a little bit and I forgot to play it last bit. And finally, just to get an idea, because when we're listening to kids audition who haven't had time to figure out their mouthpieces, who haven't had time to figure out their horns, who are playing what a school gave them or what they can afford, it's going to sound different than a professional setup and like a boutique set of mouthpieces. Let me play the same two pieces for you on one setup. This is the Jupiter with the Bach 1.5 G, because you might have students that show up that just don't know what they don't know yet, or they're not able to afford the right equipment, or they're not able to afford 1,000 different mouthpieces to try or whatnot. And what we hear through what they have is just as important as hearing where they're at currently. Let's see what this Jupiter sounds like with this Bach 1.5 G after playing these other more boutique, like customized horns. The Haydn. Now, of course, watch that be everybody's absolute favorite and the best sounding one of the bunch, because, you know, why not? So there you have it. There's an introduction to bass trombones, a couple of different styles and brands and makes of bass trombones and valves, a couple of different mouthpieces on two of the most standard audition material, and how and why it sounds different than tenor trombone. If you want to write B2, write it for a bass trombone. I could fake it on the tenor, but it doesn't feel as good. But bass trombone is a beautiful instrument, and I hope that gives you a little bit of overview of what it's like. All right, thanks for listening.